So the first thing, if you haven't seen the other videos in this series, I suggest you go back to the first one in the board, The Not So Secrets of Success. What we're going to be talking here builds on a lot of that content, so if you haven't been through the hero's journey, you don't know the stages and the traps, this might be a little confusing, so I'd suggest that you go back and take a look at those. If you have been through those, you've hopefully started to notice by now how this plays out in your life. The idea that this story of the hero's journey is what happens when we face any challenge, whether it's in our personal lives, whether it's in our professional lives, our family lives, and the traps that occur you may have started to notice in yourself. And if you've again seen some of the videos going back out into the world, you may have noticed yourself being stuck in the knower trap, right? Being certain that you have the answer and sort of confusing your judgment for a fact. Or the victim trap, looking for sources of the gap in others, outside of yourself, and focusing on the things that you don't control rather than the things that you do control. Or you may have noticed yourself in the sucker's choice, thinking that like I either have to give up my values, sort of betray myself, in order to get an outcome, or I can get the outcome, or I can keep my values, right? Be loyal to myself or be true to myself, but I have to give up the outcome. And noticing that this is usually the sucker's choice, that there's a way to both be true to your values, to play with honor, and to play to win. Now, while I think this is useful when you have it sort of up in front of you, it's kind of a complex model to use in a day-to-day business sense. So in this session, what I want to do is take this into a simpler version that might be more applicable really in the business setting. So I think that you can actually take this model and condense it down into 4 stages, because what we're really talking about is problem solving here. Now, we still have the external world, right, of having and doing, of results and behaviors. And we have the internal world of knowing and being, of thoughts, emotions, values, and the traps still exist. But for the moment, if you're thinking in the moment of, well, how would I use this, say, in a business meeting, I think being able to keep in mind these 4 S's, sense, seek, solve, start, will help you apply this. And what I want to do today is just walk through these one by one, and maybe even take an example of how they would actually play out in a very concrete tactical situation. So the first stage is sensing, literally paying attention. So whether I'm a leader, whether I'm a member of a team, one of the things that's a hallmark of successful teams is that they're connected to the world. They notice what's going on, right? Often leaders are surprised in 360 feedback. They get feedback, say, that they're micromanaging. It means they haven't been sensing. If you're getting that feedback and you're surprised, you haven't been connected to the world, you haven't known what's going on. If you're a team and you realize that there's been a shift in the organization so that something that you're working on is going to be affected, and that comes as a surprise to you, again, that it's been going on for a while and you haven't noticed, you haven't been effectively sensing. So how do we effectively sense? Well, one way is to divide the world up into sort of buckets so that we can look at the world as a system. There's so much that we could be looking at out there that it's often difficult for us to make sense of it all or to know where to scan. And I'll propose that this is a useful way to scan the world. The idea of the it, the we, and the I has been around in a long time. It exists in a lot of different philosophical systems. A guy named Ken Wilber used this particular articulation of it as the it, the we, and the I. What it means basically, though, is that there's 3 things that we can use to scan the world. By the it, we mean the external world, right? Literally the things that are going on out there that are physical, measurable. So in a business sense, are we achieving our goals? Are we making revenue targets, profitability targets? Are we gaining market share? Products that we produce are part of the it. Are the products of good quality, right? And the we, what we're looking at is relationships. Do we have trust and alignment, right? So are people, do we have a sense of community, or are we fragmented, right? What's the social map, for example? Who hangs out together? What's the social structure of the group that we're in? The I then is the self. It's first and foremost yourself. Are we paying attention to our own assumptions, our own beliefs, our own values, the way that we're showing up? And all three of these become essential if we're going to have effectiveness in a team or even in a whole organization, right? You can have a great it. You can be very organized, great structure, great business plan, and you'll fall apart if you don't have trust. So that the greatest process in the world won't work if the people engaged in the process don't trust each other. And then trust becomes dependent on the people who are talking about trusting each other, the people in the system. If I have grumpy people or people who are not engaged, or people who are just sort of checking the box, or just they're showing up in body but not in spirit, we don't create trust. And if we don't create trust, we don't get business outcomes. And by the way, if we don't get business outcomes, it impacts the I, right? So if we're not getting business outcomes, the individuals don't feel good. And so these become sort of a three-legged stool, right? If any one of these becomes short for too long, we begin to wobble. Again, either if I'm a leader, if I'm not paying attention to one of these, as a team, or as a full organization. So I'll propose this as a useful way to scan the environment. And again, there's many other systems models. This one I find useful because of its simplicity. So are we paying attention to all three of these dimensions? Now, the aspects, I want to introduce something that's called the integral model. And the integral model has to do with taking these three dimensions where gaps can occur and then taking them into depth. In the first video in this series, we talked about the gap and the sort of the source of gaps. And we want to sort of expand that a little bit here by thinking of gaps in all three dimensions. If we think about sensing, we will sense gaps usually in either the having or the doing. So having being the level of results, doing the level of processes and behaviors. So we can scan across these. And literally, if I'm scanning the environment as a leader, I'm looking for, are we meeting our business goals? Are people who have a sense of trust? Are people aligned? Are individuals engaged? Are they sticking around? Are they growing? Are they learning? I'll pay attention to behaviors. Behaviors are verifiable. They're very sensible, right? So I can look at business processes to see if they're working, right? I can look at the interactions that we have as people, and I notice how we're communicating, how we're making decisions or not, or how we're coordinating actions. I can look at individuals' behaviors, their work habits. I can look at leadership behaviors, how leaders set goals, how they provide feedback, how they coach people, how they lead meetings, for example. So sensing is paying attention to all these things in the environment, right? Because I can't see the gap if I'm blind to it. And the knower trap has to do with the inability to sense effectively. So once we sense, we're able to sort of see the gaps. We see things that aren't working, either in the doing or in the having, or the result. The second stage is what we call seeking. And seeking is getting to the bottom of it. So we recognize there's a gap. In a sense, it's almost having the symptom. We sense the symptom. We see the pain. We're in a meeting, for example, and we sense a lack of trust. People aren't sharing. They're not communicating. It feels like it's holding back. They're holding back. And we see this through literally the behaviors, right? We see it through facial expressions. We see it through people, or we hear it through what people are saying or not saying. Seeking is about getting to the bottom of it, right? And seeking, again, this is something we naturally do, but doing it systematically, we can do better. So one of the dangers, of course, right, is that we create a hypothesis, but we just assume we're right and we never test it. That's back into the knower trap. Seeking, and done with discipline, we start with hypotheses, and we think about what could be happening in multiple dimensions. So let's take the situation of having, say, a lack of trust in a team. This is very common in the work that I do. I'll have a team that say, look, we have a lack of trust. And of course, the first thing I'll say is, well, who doesn't trust who to do what? What are you sensing? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? So sensing first gives us data. And then we'll come back to say, well, what could it be? What are the possibilities that could be the sources of the lack of the trust? And we look for ways to test them. Right? Now, testing can be from very formal things, right? Like doing interviews or doing surveys in the case of figuring out trust in the team, to simply putting the question on the table and saying, does this make sense? Right? Now the other side of seeking is, do we know what the goal is? Trust becomes an interesting thing. So if we say, well, what we want to have is trust, how would we, that's not a very clearly defined goal for me. How would we know if we trusted each other? Have we defined what it would look like, literally? Things that, again, we'd be able to verify, not just sort of a feeling or intuition. The integral model can help us, again, as we're looking for the sources of, for example, lack of trust, because it takes us down into the knowing and the being, this sort of more invisible world. So if you think about it, trust is an outcome, right, in the we. Where could the sources of trust be? Well, imagine what we're sensing is people are arguing, they're fighting. So we're sensing in the interactions, and we're sensing in the result, right, about the lack of trust. So often the easiest thing to do is look in the same thing. Well, the issue, if the issue is lack of trust, it's because of the way people are working together, and it's because they don't share beliefs, right? And so we look in sort of the human side of this, the we and the I. But trust, for example, could also be in the infrastructure. Infrastructure, or the system in the it, includes roles, includes the goals that people are given. So, for example, if we think in the infrastructure, your systems, your physical layout, even a source of lack of trust could be in lack of role clarity. That there haven't been roles designed so two people think they own the same thing. They could be, for example, in conflicting goals. Two people have been given goals that conflict. Now, this looks like a we thing or even an I thing, but it could have a source in the it. Even the physical location, we have a lack of trust, but people are physically set up on different floors in the building where they never see each other. That could contribute, right? Now, there also could be things in the we and the I, right? The mental models, the beliefs that people have about each other. There could be the lack of trust, could be in relationships. Two people can be fighting not because they're having an issue, but because the people they have relationships are having an issue, the relationships that aren't obvious to us. And then asking ourselves, sort of, if we go back up to the have, well, if the issue is trust, so what would trust look like? How would we know if we had it? And usually in this, we're going to see it through some sort of behaviors, right? So the way who's talking to who, how we're making decisions, those are going to be the indicators for whether we have trust or not, right? So seeking then also has to have, if I'm going to define trust, how would I know if we had trust? It's probably going to be back into these areas, into individual behaviors or interactions, because trust happens in these sides of it, right? So in the end, seeking is about understanding both ends of the gap. Where I am, what would goodness look like? What would success look like? And then seeking is understanding, why aren't we there already? What's keeping us from simply moving toward the future state? So put a pause here, and we'll come back and look at the solving and starting in the next session.